And we'll now move on to our featured speaker, who is one of our members. Mike, and I'd like to introduce him. Mike King, one of our AARP community group members. Mike is an organizer, a fundraiser, and activist vested in a variety of Chicago's churches, communities, and nonprofits, as well as a wide variety of arts, entertainment, and economic developments for community cultivation, local social activism, job readiness, and life skill coaching. Mike has a Master's of Arts for Social Justice and Community Development from Loyola University, and is active in his Family Heritage Foundation, named the Bone Crutcher Family Heritage Foundation. Also, the Association of College Unions, International Committee on Multicultural Programs. And for those who have been with Lunch Bunch, you know he's part of the Buttercup Park Advisory Council as vice president. Also, Christian Community Development Association, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, Community Renewal Society, board member of Habits Men's Group, and Senior Voices at Center on Halsted. So as you can see, Mike is a busy guy. With his interest and background in community activism, he is perfect person to speak to us on the meaning and history of Juneteenth. And maybe even afterwards, he can tell us a little about his own personal efforts for something called, and I'll leave that for the end.
Okay.
So welcome. We'd love to hear from you, Mike.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fran, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, for this opportunity, and particularly, thanking the leadership, you, Georgia, Dan, and all of you for giving me this opportunity to speak on the Juneteenth just a little bit. Yes, first of all, let me just, kind of quantify myself, and let you know that, my parameters on this subject matter of Juneteenth, of course, is limited. I am not a historian. I'm not a sociologist or anything like that. I'm really, presenting this to you, from a personal perspective and from my life experience, with some of my forefathers, being slaves. And so I guess at this point, I'm going to share the screen and go to my presentation. I guess just to start off, who knows about Juneteenth?
Well, I do.
Who knew? I just asking, like, who knew about it, and further, like, who cares?
Well,
That's what we, are looking at and finding out as we hear about these big in the media issues that are going on with, like, the Tulsa, and the fact that Juneteenth, in fact, will be coming up on the 19th of June, and there are many, many celebrations that will be taking place. But speaking for myself, I knew nothing about Juneteenth as a child, growing up, and really didn't find out anything about it until well into my adulthood, which sounds surprising, somewhat. But as you can maybe guess, oftentimes there are folks other than Black folks who know a lot more history about slavery and Emancipation Proclamation and all those events that took place, and more so than some of us who consider ourselves somewhat, educated. And so I really didn't find out about this until much, much later. So here is the definition of the Juneteenth that I took as a source from Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation here in Chicago. And I'll just read this definition. Juneteenth is a
Right. I
celebration of
know.
Black resilience. It marks a day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people be freed. From this freedom came in a full 2.5 years after the
Well,
signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Unfortunately, Black people still feel the effects of such oppressive antics rooted in anti Blackness.
it is a mess.
Here is my grandparents, the Reverend Cersei Crutcher
Mm.
and Elizabeth Bone Crutcher. And this picture was taken in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the 1960s. I had to
Hmm.
dig back in my into my brother's archives to pull out this picture. And so I want to start with them because they are the core of the Bone Crutcher Family Heritage Foundation that I've tried to establish and start and get going.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
in which they both are from uh, Huntsville, Alabama, Madison County, the outskirts, of Huntsville proper. And here they are established in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It didn't start off that way.
No.
Uh, it didn't start off that way. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to tell you about um, my grandfather's side, the Crutcher side, in which you can see that we call him Daddy. My mom affectionately couldn't pronounce Daddy because it's the South, and she started calling him Daddy. And all the rest of my aunts and uncle and cousins have been calling him Daddy ever since. And um, there, going back to Madison County, Alabama, I must say that I tried to imagine myself meeting my great grandfather, David Crutcher, who was born a slave
Wow.
in Madison County. He was born in 1851. And so he was right there in Madison County, farming, some decade or so, little, maybe a dozen years or so, uh, even before the Civil War started.
Oh, sure.
And he and the many others, were farming. Uh, Actually, it was cotton. Cotton was still king, even like 1850s, 1860s, all the way up to
Yeah.
it was still king, even in Alabama. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
he was just a child, growing up, right there. But what happened when the slaves were freed in that 1863 or so, after emancipation, my great grandfather, David Crutcher, uh, he continued to farm the land there, that plantation, which was called the Jude Estate, there in Huntsville, Madison County area, until, of course, he was freed, emancipated, and he continued all the way up until like 1906 when he and two other farmers in that area, they were able through um, reconstruction or somewhat of a, I guess you can say, is actually extended into the Jim Crow area, but uh, he and two other farmers were able to purchase for $2,000, 154 acres, uh, what was historically had been the Jude Estate. They bought the property with the assistance from the New Orleans branch of the Federal Land Bank. And this was a federal agency which loaned money to farmers. And
Wow.
so they were able to finance $1,400 of the purchase price. But the men owned the entire acreage
Gosh.
equally, and they divided it among themselves.
Wow.
So interestingly, Crutcher, my grandfather, David, one of the other two farmers, Battle and Kelly, and their wives. They took out a second mortgage to pay the federal land bank debt, and then great grandfather David and my great grandmother Lucy, uh, uh, their proportion happened to contain the house, and this house was built way back in like 1812, but they continued to farm uh, that piece of property, which I'm trying to imagine even like 154 acres, and then divided by three. So he had roughly 50 acres, and he was generous enough and able to set aside and lease out some land, for a church, that sat there near and on the property, and also lease out land to the Alabama Normal, which became the state agricultural and mechanical college, a historically black college, in which uh, my great grandfather was able to run like a demonstration farm, for the college to teach the young farmers how to farm and such. And as of now, um, since the property was built somewhere around like 1812, like in 2012, we were able to, go down and have the family reunion and such. And, that property actually is a historical um, uh, landmark now. So I want to go back to the whole topic matter of Juneteenth and of freedom. Freedom, as we know, that what does that mean? Before the slave, I try to put myself inside of them to try to see, well, what must they have felt like, when all of a sudden in Alabama, they get the message that they're free. And, like here, they've been farming and working for the quote unquote master. And then all of a sudden they say, well, you're free, you can go. Well, what do? They don't have any assets. If previously they've, been quote unquote property. And so what do? And so as I was reading, doing a little research, I don't know, are you guys able to see these two books that, of course, are, written by Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. And I just, read excerpts. Of course, I've read, both of the books and just read about the mass confusion that it was when all of a sudden the slaves are free. So just imagine them just kind of wandering, like all over. In many, many cases, as you can guess, you know, the majority of folks just continued to work and eventually made some kind of arrangements with the quote unquote master, and they continue to try to sustain. But those who chose to go out on their own, as you can suspect, now all of a sudden, the state legislatures and the legal system start, these black codes start coming up, and these oppressive approaches start to kind of press the people back into not quite slavery, but very, very similar to slavery, which eventually became Jim Crow in like the 1819, 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson deal. So all of a sudden, like they've shifted back almost to, like slavery, where by law was supposed to be, of course, separate but equal, but it definitely was not separate but equal. And while down there in Alabama, in Madison County, I was able to see both at the Crutcher home and the Bone home both places where they had the slave quarters. And basically at the Crutcher home, they were people, the slaves were housed underneath the house. It was like a, kind of like a vast uh, basement. Everybody crowded into this. I don't know how they did it. They did it because they had to do it, and all had to do all they could to survive. And of course, I'm not getting the best picture because I couldn't picture what it was like 150 years ago or so. Maybe, well, hopefully, things were in better shape and people did have their quarters and their little beds and that, but it certainly didn't seem like it, when I looked at it in 2012 when we were down there for that big family reunion. And so a significant amount of the folks who have, you know, been separated and into these using these not really equal public facilities. Uh, I even saw some of the remnants left over since I was born in like 1954, which was a strategic year because that's also the year that the Brown versus the Board of Topeka Education, then when that big Supreme Court ruling, landmark ruling came, I was born during that time. But of course, as you all probably know, none of those uh, legal impacts really took place. The remnants of the Jim Crow and of the previous time periods were still there. Even as a little boy, with my other grandmother, King Mama, appropriately named King Mama, and they said that I gave her that name. I'm not sure, but they said that. Well, we were over by the Lookout Mountain, which is right there, like just south part of it is in Georgia, Chattanooga, and I could see the old water fountains. They were colored right there, white right here, and there was no comparison. You're just talking about some water. We just want to drink of water. And you have to have this dilapidated fountain and then this beautiful fountain. It's just like, to me, just like silly, but it had, of course, far more impact than that. It was institutional. It was indeed inferior to the point where, like many of the Black peoples who've taken advantage of their freedom, they started to try to migrate, to better opportunities. Matter of fact, my grandfather died. He had planned, from when my great grandfather passed away in about 1924, he had taken his little inheritance and he was on his way to Detroit to work in the auto industry. But my grandmother, Elizabeth, she just happened to be pregnant with my mom. And it was about that 9 months time. And she had the baby right there. Which was my mom in Chattanooga, and they remain in Chattanooga, and bought the property right there in Chattanooga, which still remains today. Uh, Now, the little house, where you saw my grandparents on the porch, that house no longer is there because it got so dilapidated we couldn't keep it up. And so it's just these two big pieces of property, of land that's right there, that we have to decide, well, what are we going to do with it? And that's part of what the Bone Crusher Family Heritage is all about. So, but anyway, so the Great Migration took place, and my parents, even though my great grandparents only got to Chattanooga, my dad and mom, we end up migrating north to Lafayette, Indiana. And I don't know how he was thinking about that, but evidently it was some deliberate thought in migrating to a college town. Purdue was right there in Lafayette, West Lafayette. And that's where, we end up settling. And I went to, like grade school, high school there, and on to College of Ball State there in Indiana, in Muncie, Indiana. And then eventually, made my way to Chicago. But in between that time, in those late 50s and the 60s, everyone knows what took place. The civil rights movement was in progress. And it's almost like for me, as a child, I knew no different. There was always these big demonstrations. There was always something at the church. There was always, these big programs. There was always these marches. There was always the dogs out there jumping on the people, the kids, and like I said, I didn't know any different. And so and it still is taking place. And so I say all that to point out like what Dr. King said in his book, which I has his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Can you guys see that?
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah. Where do we go from here? You know, chaos or community? And we find that that question is an ongoing question. We keep asking it over and over and over. Where do we go from here? And have even transform and transition into this new era that we're calling the Black Lives Matter. Now, for me, of course, as you know and can guess, I was part of that civil rights, as a product of the civil rights movement and all those equal opportunity, programs that got me to college and got me along. But now, here, some 50, 60 years later, uh, some of the same things are still going on. It's amazing how that is. And so, one of the key things is to look, well, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, a big deal was that, the folks up north and mom and dad and my uncles and all of them that came north, they were able to vote. And I never did really quite understand that connection between voting rights and empowerment. I mean, I just didn't connect. Well, what how does voting rights have to do with empowerment? But as you can see in the news today, it makes a difference. Every vote does indeed count. And we can see how, some of the same retrenchments that took place like after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the Juneteenth, is like it's happening all over again. The progress that was made, like in the 60s and 70s, that's been turned back. Uh, the progress that was made, here recently in the 21st century, that's been turned back. So what do we do about it? Thank God for leaders, you know, uh, you know, like Dr. King, like Malcolm X, like the Reverend uh, William Barber and such. So, as part of community organizing components, leadership development has to take place. We have to train those behind us or be able to identify some of those behind us to come up and take the reins of community organizing and community development. And what do we do first? One of the key things in community organizing is listening to the people. Definitely, we don't want just anybody just landing into just flying into our communities and just dictating what we need to do. We need to hear the issues of the people and try to hear, well, what is it that prevents you from advancing to this next job or this next, we need to hear what problem. And so that's one of the key things that I've seen over the years that has taken place, that is been perpetuated by some of to listen to people. What is the issue? Maybe one of the key issues, like the vice president has said, is, it could be childcare. Maybe childcare is the key thing in keeping the kids safe that prevents, like mom and dad and for the people from going to work and from the younger people from continuing in school. They may have to drop out of school to try to help families, depending on what the families is like, because the Black family has been, splintered and just all over the place. And how do you reel that back all in together? And we saw and we are seeing, this entire weekend about the Greenwood neighborhood, there in Tulsa, where even though it was segregated, under the Jim Crow, a lot of the Black workers, trades folks, they were able to come together, even in a segregated environment, and be productive. It was like the amazing thing to look at, back in the 1910s and 1920s, which I mentioned that was supposed to be the start of the Roaring Twenties. That the economy was booming and such. And from what we understand, there in Tulsa, as an example, uh, you know, the folks that come together and they were able to keep that money circulating right there in the community with all the professional, doctors and by that time, the automobile industry had come in. They had mechanics, and then the oil business was booming out there, and so they, as you have heard these last few days, it made for a vibrant neighborhood. And so we continue to try to do that kind of community programs that coming through in many cases the church, the Black church, and the many other uh, faith-based organizations that and other community organizations, NAACP and such, to try to advance the people. And Dr. King had already always, had a holistic approach, to trying to pull this thing together as he, talked about, like his relationship with the pastors down south and how, like he had coffee with them, met with them, and well, when is that time, for, to try to advance, like um, voting rights and new housing and attack this poverty situation. So he took a holistic, approach, to it, even though he was disappointed. And in, like that letter in the Birmingham jail, he acknowledges, a lot of his disappointment in what happened there in the South. And so in community development, which is different than community organizing. These are like two different functions, though oftentimes we use them interchangeably. But community development is more about sustainability, housing, economic development, arts and culture, and faith-based approaches to community development, with, of course, sustainability being key because we're trying to sustain life. We need that clean water. We need clean air. We need to live in an environment where we're not being choked off by pollution or choked off by waste and dumps garbage. We need like quality resources to be able to live. And in order to do that, we have to have housing. And even as a child, I was just like, I could not understand why dad could not move into a better, housing situation as we were in kids. We were just refined to that little Black neighborhood in Lafayette, Indiana, where I know dad was making pretty good money as a construction worker and a plumber, but they wouldn't let him move and they wouldn't, provide the loans for him to, get a mortgage. And that's even after he's a World War II veteran, speaking of Memorial Day. He's a World War II veteran and he couldn't even get the GI loan. He just couldn't. So what happens with economic development? Well, we're able to work and save, but work and save to what extent? There, like we, as a family, for us, we were somewhat land rich. I want to say it. I'm blessed and fortunate to be able to say that, in the sense that my great grandfather kind of set the course, by him having that property there, on my grandmother's side there, the bone side of the great grandparents, they didn't own the property, but they did own that area where the slave quarters sat, and that land where the graveyard set. And we've been there to that property that is owned by one of my cousins, or set of cousins, down there in Huntsville. But the gravestones are dilapidated, though. I had this eerie feeling when I saw this gravestone that said born in 1854, like 100 years before I was born. And there it was. It's like, and so it's kind of like a scary thing. The land was there, but opportunity for jobs and careers and professionalism, it wasn't there. So were we free? Yes, I suppose we were free, but we had to fend on our own. So a lot of things went into that intense creativity of the arts and the culture. And I can just imagine, like in the 19 teens and 1920s, when all of the blues players, like, from Mississippi and New Orleans and down in the Delta, all of a sudden they start coming up to Chicago and Detroit, and that blues as we know it here in Chicago was going on. And the artists and the musicians, they made money, in that respect, with their creativity and their music and their presentation, as such as it is still, a staple right here in Chicago. And just having recently, like, took that reverse migration back to uh, New Orleans, like when I was at Loyola. It was so interesting to hear that music down in New Orleans, and it dawned on me, say, oh, this is where this came from, because it was deep and good in your soul. It was all the way, Fats Domino, and like a Satchmo. It was just like so much fun. But with all of that, of course, uh, faith-based approaches needed to take place, because it was important that the people had some integrity and some sense of knowing that there's a maker, that there's is one that uh, uh, more powerful, obviously, to be able to uh, put some spiritual um, you, like indoctrination in you. And so faith-based organizations and churches were always a big part of community development. And this right here, this is me and Dr. John Perkins, who is in charge. He's a founding member of the Christian Community Development Association. And we just happened to be there at one of his galas at the McCormick Place when they had the big CCDA National Conference here in Chicago back in 2018. And as you can see, like his personality. I told Dr. Perkins, I said, Dr. Perkins, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. He has this beautiful personality, and he treated me just like I was one of his kids. And a matter of fact, like he kind of reminded me of my dad, just in his laid back. As you can see, he had me busting out laughing. And then somebody just happened to catch us. And I said, that's a great shot of me and then Dr. Perkins. So I can't really quite consider Dr. Perkins like my mentor per se, because I don't see him, and he hasn't really had a chance to teach me directly. Uh, um, like he's really, more like just a leader who I totally identify with. And you can see that, it's important to get that kind of training, at least somebody to identify with who you want to be like. That's for sure. And he's definitely that for me. And so we take a look now at, I chose just 5 of these leaders that I've already mentioned. And the first two, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, they, as you may or may not know, had kind of contrasting views on how they envision the black folks, coming out of slavery and what they should be doing. Uh, Dr. Du Bois, you know, he of course was Harvard graduate, and he, you know, was the more intellectual in the sense of thinking of big time going after your dreams and your careers and such. Whereas Booker T. Washington was more of suggesting that the young people, they try to find a trade. And he was the founder of Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee University, that's down in Alabama as well. And his emphasis was, for the former slave folks to find a trade, carpentry, plumbing. And ironically, that's what my dad ended up doing. He was really a plumber by trade, but he really was a master of all. He could do everything. He could, he was a carpenter. It used to be so much fun, looking at my dad. Like when we were growing up in Lafayette, he used to fix all the kids' bikes. All the kids used to bring their bikes over. He had like, they would always come, Mr. King, can you fix something? And he always fixed the kids' bikes. And I just thought he was just so wonderful in that way. And as a plumber and in the neighborhood, he was always the person called on in the winter when the pipes broke. And this is the old black neighborhood in Lafayette, Indiana. That's before urban renewal came in and just wiped out the whole neighborhood. Even in a smaller, like environment like Lafayette, Indiana. It came right through the hospital bottle, the city bottle, and just came right through the neighborhood, wiped out the churches, wiped out the little bars and little clubs, and wiped out all the housing. I mean, like it was like an intentional strategy that happened in cities all over, including places like uh, Tulsa and like Kansas City, to just come right and just wipe out all of that housing that was already inexpensive. And it just, led for more and more housing issues, more than it was. And of course, as Dr. King did as much as he could. He was just so vibrant. I'd like to be like Dr. King as well, but Dr. King was right there in the mix of, all of the labor movements, with the garbage men down there in Memphis and, amongst many, many other things, and both he and Malcolm X, they contrast. They had contrasting styles because as Malcolm, he was going to do it by any means necessary, and he wasn't playing. He wasn't playing either, and he meant that. You can see it on his face. And I appreciate all of those brothers and try to extract as much as I can to incorporate in the way I carry myself as well. So currently, we have the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who's like we just missed him when I went to a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. He does the Moral Mondays, in Raleigh, and he was doing that, when healthcare was a huge big deal, and it's still a huge deal. But he has been the most prevalent, and very similar to Dr. Perkins, Dr. John Perkins, but he is. We even had him, at the Lakeview Press, when we did that documentary, and we heard his speech and his fire and his intentions, and I just really, really admire, how he goes about, like expressing, what we need, in terms of quote unquote freedom, and this is far and beyond emancipation and far and beyond Juneteenth. And so I think, you know, the approach that I gathered that stood out to me most is the one that I uh, was able to gather from Dr. Dubois. And he kind of took over this so-called quote unquote like agency, where you're responsible for your own life and that kind of thing, and really use this expression of existentialism. And I had to look that, I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what that meant. I saw it as I was reading his book, The Soul of Black Folks. But existentialism, it is a philosophical theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of goodwill. Existentialists believe that they have control over their choices and actions, that society should not restrict an individual's life or actions, and that these restrictions inhibit free will and the development of that person's potential. That is so weighted. I had to really think about that because I'm trying to be my own person, but I'm not trying to impose on others. But yet we can have a lively debate and we can present our pros and cons of the situation. But I don't want you oppressing me and, you know, suppressing me and repressing me in that respect. I want that uninhibited free will. And so I wanted to end with the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, some respect. I really and truly wanted to share with you all a song called To Be Young and Gifted and Black. But I couldn't quite figure out the technology to get it in there so you all can listen to. I know it's there, but my computer or my program wasn't compatible, and I wasn't able to do it. But the song goes something like this: To be young, gifted, and black, we must begin to tell our young that there's a world waiting for you. You are the quest that's just begun. But when you feel lean real low under the pressure, you should never have known that you're young, gifted, and black, with your soul's intact. That's a fact. To be young, gifted, and black. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. And I want to end it on my vision of trying to put together the next movement beyond Juneteenth. And I'm calling it July-teenth. And what July-teenth is, it is an annual, July-teenth is the annual creative celebratory window of time, July 13th through 19th, all those teenths, to recognize a comparable acknowledgement of all Black families and families of color after emancipation and other bouts of ethnic oppression and suppression. Not only will this be a time to inventory our sociological and economic gains through the span of 100 years since Africans were kidnapped and brought to America in 1619, it will be a time of family love, and I emphasize family love, Black on Black love, and cultural learning of heritage, such as family reunions, family anniversaries, and the community family gatherings, such as the Bone Crusher Family Heritage Foundation's periodic fundraising galas to maintain and develop relevant historical properties for educational, cultural, artistic, and architectural purpose. And so that's July 18th. And that has been my vision. And whether or not it become a quote unquote reality, we have to wait and see. So with that, uh, that is the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. That was great personal, you know, taking us through history.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.